Welcome to memoQ Talks, where we talk to industry leaders about their experiences, lessons learned, and what works best across all areas of localization. Now here's your host.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this newest episode of memoQ Talks. Today my guest is David Hardisty, who has been until recently a fellow at the Nova University in Lisbon, and he is coming through to us from Lisbon today. And David has more than 25 years of experience as a translator, but even more as a really a Renaissance man, dealing with technology, peace studies, language learning, and eventually translation and translation technology. So, when I looked at his profile, I saw that the first time he started dealing with computers was actually 1970. So I think we have a lot to talk about. But before we do that, please like the video if you do, and subscribe to the memoQ Talks channel. Also, you can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or other podcasting applications. So, David, we are absolutely honored to have you here on memoQ Talks. And before we came here, we had a bit of a chat on LinkedIn, and this is how I know that you had an education in mathematics, physics, German, civil engineering, and then peace studies, with some of the studies conducted in the Middle East and elsewhere. And at the beginning of the career, you had been working with refugees in the UK and in Sudan. And I'm roughly at 1/4 of the list that I saw about you. And your interest in technology and languages seems to go hand in hand. Actually, that is shared by a number of us. But I'm also sensing that you have been driven mostly by your aspiration to help people who had not had the good fortune to be born in the Western world. So what was your main motive in putting your skills at work that way? First peace studies, later language education and translation. And what were your most important takeaways from your time helping refugees?
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. As you mentioned, I studied mainly sciences at school, then included German in that, and went to university to study civil engineering because at the time I had a guru, an Indian guru, and I asked the movement, what should I do to help the movement? And they said, go and do civil engineering. I later discovered the person who had advised me to do that had studied civil engineering. So maybe it wasn't such a divine intervention as more the person's practical experience. In my teens, I was very interested in the meaning of life, to use a cliche. My twin sister at that time then told me the meaning of life, which is basically wake up and get on with it. And I realized that I couldn't just do a course in civil engineering because somebody told me to do it. I also realized that I was interested in maths really as a language, a formal system, but still a language. So I decided to study peace studies. The senior professor at the time had written a book called Mystics and Militants. So it seemed like I at least satisfied the first half of that title, although I had no wish to be a militant. That's what attracted me to peace studies, realizing a personal journey for myself and then interest in society. That was a lot of people study education, and an idealistic scenario might come up. We actually, at the end of the first year, we were the first course in the United Kingdom to study peace studies, and I was in the first year. At the end of the first year, we all went off to a commune in Scotland, the staff and the students, to plan the second year together. It was a very idealistic course set up with the help of the Quakers, which had a background in negotiation. My senior professor, Adam Curl, I'd actually worked behind the scenes to bring about the peace in what was then Rhodesia, which later, of course, became Zimbabwe. So I was very affected and influenced by him. And so when the course ended, during the course, we had to do a year away. So I went to Israel, Palestine, spent 6 weeks in Jerusalem learning Arabic, did a month on a kibbutz, then went down to the Gaza Strip for a month to stay with the head of the UNRWA kindergartens. So I was very lucky at a very young age to get direct experience of refugees in situ, of course, in an area that's been very much in the news in the last, has always been in the news, but particularly for sad reasons of conflict in the last 12 months or so. When
But
my
but
when my
what
degree finished,
yeah, but
yeah,
your time there was the mid 70s, if I take
uh,
it
yeah, this was 77.
77.
Actually, I was in Jerusalem when Sadat visited
Hmm.
on this bus going from the outskirts of Jerusalem to the center at a crazy pace, so the driver could get back to watch the greetings live on television. So it was at that time when there were overtures of peace between Israel and Egypt. So that was my first experience of refugees. Then I decided after studying to take a job with Vietnamese refugees that had been resettled to the United Kingdom. And then after that, I went to Sudan for a couple of years to work as a volunteer English teacher in Sudanese technical schools. But I also worked with refugees from Eritrea that had been settled in Sudan and were going to be resettled in the United States. So I was very lucky. I got the experience of refugees in situ, refugees displaced to a neighboring country, and then refugees settling in a host country. Very early on, I got the 360-degree experience of refugee, shall we say. And that was my first work before I came to Portugal and then started working here at the British Council. I'd done a postgraduate certificate in education at the what was called at the time London Institute of Education, which is now linked with University College London as the Educational Institute of London University. And I did a curriculum option to try and show that the emerging interest in use of computers in the educational curriculum, I thought I was very cynical about this, so I decided to do that. This was then at the time of the mid 80s, when, of course, personal computers were, well, not exploding. That would be a wrong way of putting it. But suddenly we discovered that you could have your own computer, your own personal computer in your home. And uh, I came here to Portugal, and in my second year, I worked in Lisbon, which was one of the first for the British Council, which is one of the first centres to get personal computers. And I, with a couple of other people, we started to scratch our heads working out how we could use computers in teaching English. Of why it's important to remember the time was I had about 60 teachers in that institute, about 5,000 students coming part-time to learn English. And of course, the teachers did not have experience of computers because they didn't have them. So a very different time from nowadays, or perhaps not, but that's the part of the story later on. So I helped get people used to, well, I went to Lancaster University to do a course, and at the risk of sounding immodest, they said, come back next year and help to teach it. Um, so, and then I worked with somebody called Scott Windy up there, and we produced a book for Oxford University Press on how to use computers in language learning. And really, that was the interest in using computers in language learning. The area at the time was called computer assisted language learning. And the
Yeah,
secret always is to make the C in computer a small one and make the language learning the important thing. So you look at how the ideas of how you are teaching the language or how you're helping students to learn the language and try and put that methodology into the computers.
I
There
must
was a
have
very
seen
nice,
like Sorry, I must have seen that book that you mentioned from Oxford University Press, simply because back at the time that you're talking about, I was in high school, but I was also learning English in a class at International House, and my teacher there was also the local representative of Oxford University Press. So
Okay.
this will actually prompt me to do some digging. And also at the time, my father and I, who has a similar background as yourself to an extent, because first he started off teaching about literature and languages, and later on in the early 70s went on to learn about programming and computers and databases and
Yeah.
such like.
Yeah.
And
I got,
yeah,
no, just because I forgot to mention, you mentioned 1970. I think it was 70, 71. The local university gave my school an old computer, so they
yeah,
tried to find a room to put it in, and the maths teacher decided to teach us all a little bit of Fortran. So I got my hands on a little bit of, well, I got my hands on cards to start coding
yeah.
um, at a time long before other people. Yeah, but
So,
uh,
So yeah, I'm only now realizing I'm speaking to one of the main authorities in the field of computer assisted language learning, because I must have seen that book, and this book was part of what inspired us. Well, that was my dad and I to actually create some language learning applications, which we showcased at an event in 1986 at an event in Budapest organized by the International House. So
right,
so
okay,
yeah, we must have had more in common in the 80s than we realize. So
yeah,
that makes this all the more fascinating.
yeah.
But I
I did
interrupted
my
you, so
first,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I did my first teaching course with International House in London in oh, I don't know, in the mid 80s. So
Yeah.
yes, they've always had a very good reputation for encouraging the teaching of English.
So
Mm.
it's quite fascinating that you were active in that. And I will definitely dig up that book. And it's even possible that my father has it in his library. So
Okay, I don't know. Okay.
I will let you know. I will let you know. I don't know myself. But you also said you also write this about yourself, that you have 25 years of experience translating from Portuguese into English.
Yeah.
And I heard you because we can tell the audience that last week we were together at an event in Lisbon, where I saw you interact with the Portuguese students and teachers and researchers, and you were asking questions in Portuguese, and your Portuguese is pretty convincing. So how did that happen? Because we also say you started off as someone at the British Council in Portugal, putting together a computer network so that teachers can use computers in language learning. So
Yeah.
how did the shift to translating from Portuguese into English happen?
Oh, gradually. First of all, perhaps I should say when I came to Portugal, it was because I'd met and fallen in love with a Portuguese lady. Not a very original reason, but the reason I'm starting my answer with that is I came to Portugal already as part of a Portuguese circle, shall we say. So in my first year here, I was at Queenborough University. I did a Portuguese language introduction course. Then I did a couple more, and these were courses of about 15 hours a week. They were quite solid courses. I used to go out of my classes and run up the steps to the university and run back down to teach. So that's really why. I think a lot of people nowadays, for example, digital nomads, they come to Portugal and they find it's almost not necessary to learn Portuguese because everybody's happy to speak English with them. I was lucky in that I was very much part of a Portuguese circle, so I wanted to learn Portuguese. I never spoke Portuguese to my English students, which once I started working in universities in 1989 onwards, I had more reasons to speak Portuguese. I had more reasons to interact. And gradually my Portuguese improved. I think one of the first translations I did was with a colleague for an art catalogue for the Centre for Modern Art here. and it was rather difficult to decipher this art catalogue. Probably not the only one either. So we decided two heads were better than one, and we worked together on that. And I gradually built up working as a translator, and it became my second job. My first job being university teaching. I've always been a very practical person. I'm not, although I'm interested in doing stuff, then reflecting on it, rather than learning theory and applying, finding a practical application. If you see what I mean, I, I go
Absolutely.
with the practical and reflect on it rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I find it
Although
very hard to.
obviously,
Yeah, I find
mm,
it very hard to learn something unless I have a very practical reason to do it. So
yeah,
maybe it's a more
yeah,
negative way of putting that, but this is just to
yeah.
say that I know what you're talking about.
But I would say, having seen people involved in using computers to teach English and using computers to facilitate translation, I don't know nowadays how many people are religious, but there's the John the Baptist story in the Bible of tempting Jesus by offering the world. When you get into technology, there is a real danger of being seduced by technology and
Oh yeah.
disappearing down the black
Oh yeah.
hole of. For example, when I worked with computers for teaching English, I learned enough programming to write a menu system, but something like programming or even technology itself, or the latest configuration or thing to do, it's an endless black hole of time. And
Oh yeah.
one divorce later, I realized you have to moderate that attraction of the black hole of time, when it comes to technology,
Yeah.
and take a step back and look at what is technology in the service of, rather than you are in the service of technology. If you see what I mean.
Absolutely. So this happened to me in my early teens and made me give up my music studies, which I regret to this
Right.
day. But later on, then, okay, I went down this rabbit hole, so let's do something useful about it. And then I went to engineering school. So this is how I was trying to resolve it, but it had to be resolved like the way, like you said. So,
Yeah.
and yet you also didn't really get away from technology, for which we actually happen to be grateful, because you were one of the first users and advocates of our own memoQ. And once these translation environments became not popular, but became more and more used in translation, became part of mainstream translation, you switched over to teaching people about technology and translation. So that's what you also did at university. And this on the one hand seems an organic development, but I also learned that you were actually one of the founders of the faculty and this kind of study program at Nova University. Tell me
Mm.
more about this, and obviously correct any inaccuracies that I might have said here.
But perhaps what might be of international interest in answering your question is how translation was considered in Portuguese education. I think something. Of course, Portugal had its revolution in 1974. I think the Portuguese Minister for Higher Education in around 1979-80 said that translation was not worthy of honours degree study. It was what we would call in Portuguese like licenciatura, a licentiate degree, an honours degree. It was only worthy of a bacharelato, an ordinary degree. And countries have always had this dichotomy of, well, universities, polytechnics, technical colleges. So the first studies of translation at an undergraduate level were really done in places that were doing courses like international secretary, accounting, tourism. These applied practical subjects were not considered worthy of honours degrees. However, my university and the University of Lisbon, Coimbra University, Porto, shall we say the traditional universities in around, I think it was 2007, opened degrees in translation. So what happened? Was there a change in thinking? Possibly, but there was also a perceived drift away of students from studying modern languages. So it could also be seen as a way to attract students back to the area. So the course was set up. I didn't teach technology at first. They got somebody from the IT department to do that. Then the person left, and I said I would be willing to do it. Because this was around 2008, financial crisis, there were no funds to employ any new teachers. So literature, culture studies teachers were told at the end of the year, have a nice summer and come back ready to teach some translation courses. Because people involved in language teaching are often also in the world of translating, there was some staff who were able to do the practical translation seminars. Some teachers had that experience, some didn't. Anyway, that was around the time I started teaching. Just 2 or 3 years later, I started teaching translation technology. And I was really one step ahead of the students the first year, and always relied on the goodwill of yourselves, and not just yourself, but other CAT tool software companies. And I'm very grateful for that. If I can give a thank you on behalf of universities around the world, it's actually very, very important that because we don't always have funds for things like software. Universities will buy computers eventually, but it's a one-off purchase. A regular allocation of finances to software is not something that is as easy, funnily enough, because that's a regular payment. I don't know if I'm explaining that clearly, but
Absolutely, and
the
we have seen that firsthand. So we
yeah,
experienced that firsthand. So and I think it's in the best interest of translation tool developers to make sure that that tool gets into education in as many places as possible, because
yeah.
that creates not only awareness and knowledge and experience for the students, but also market for the translation tool developers. And
Yeah.
we should be aware of that and admitting to that. So,
I,
and
I
which is
mean,
not a
it's
bad
pretty.
thing.
If you have young translation graduates coming onto the market and they've trained in your software, I mean, it's not too big a leap to assume that is the software they will want to use when they start working professionally. I mean, that to me seems obvious, but mm,
And it's indirectly, my experience is that this indirectly also uh, enlarges, expands the pool of talent that the translation to developers have access to. Because we have
yeah,
on the memoQ team, we have several people who have background in translation project management. Our CTO has a PhD in translation studies. So this wouldn't have happened if we hadn't started to make headways into various
yeah.
education institutes. So yeah,
Uh,
it's an important thing.
just to say, I think one of the interesting things in 2025 is look. There has been a debate in translation as to whether you should start teaching translation at the undergraduate level or at the postgraduate level. So in our case, I'm teaching, or I was teaching 18, 19-year-olds. And it's very interesting in the year 2025 to see their knowledge. Because everybody, the presupposition is this is a generation that is technologically sophisticated. Oh, they've been playing with technology since they were born almost. But that's not necessarily the case when it comes to things like, again, PCs, personal computers. We noticed several years ago that access to our university website, the majority of accesses were undertaken by use of mobile phones, not or tablets, not by personal computers. So we have 18, 19-year-olds who do not have that familiarity with personal computers that their parents would have had. So ironically, a generation that's supposed to be technologically sophisticated doesn't necessarily understand that the operating system on a tablet is not the same as on a computer. The skills that you would have expected using something like Microsoft Office 15 years ago are no longer there nowadays. So there are challenges when it comes to there are more challenges than one might think of a supposedly sophisticated technological generation.
Thank you for that. And yes, that this is very true. Also, although my children who are Gen Z learn to use computers, so they don't just use tablets or phones, but they have their own computers and
Yeah,
put it
no,
put it
no,
to
I'm not
use.
saying.
So it's not like very clear cut, but I also see what you mean. And the attitude towards computers changed among students of translation over the past 2 decades, which was also really interesting to see. But I want to go back to one of the things that you said wrote in our chat that we had before the interview. Um, you mentioned the importance of the first hour to use, and I want to ask you what this means to you, because the first hour of use to me as a software developer pretty much means that I need to make sure in terms of software design and in terms of training that a translator at a very basic level, but still becomes productive after an hour of training. And it is really important of what they see and what they are exposed to in this first hour, because that determines how efficient they will be after this 1 hour, and whether or not they will actually choose my product to continue their personal work in. So what did you mean by first hour of use? Because I was sensing that your meaning here is broader than the very utilitarian use that I put this expression to.
Well, it is also utilitarian to a certain extent. I should perhaps qualify first hour of use with first lesson of use.
Yes.
Okay, so let's say first hour and a half. The point I wanted to make was with a certain piece of software, we all have the experience of using it for the first time and our reaction to it. But we very quickly, once we've learnt the basics of using software, it's very easy to forget that initial reaction to the software. And what I wanted to emphasize in the first place was having taught memoQ for years, every semester I had a group of 20, or if I sometimes I would literally have 100 students. I would be sharing their first hour of use. Constantly, every semester was reminded of what that experience was to people. And the first point is that we forget that. It is so easy to forget that our own what an initial reaction to the software is. And there are some very basic things we think we almost dismiss because we don't consider them as being important. Because whatever with any piece of software, whatever slightly difficult things, we get over the hurdle. And then we think, oh, well, I got over the hurdle, so everybody will get over the hurdle. Just about, that's very simplistic, I know, but it's, so what do I see? So you teach people how, you try and get people to translate a small, simple Word file in the first lesson. With memoQ, that involves making a project. Making a project involves understanding and using a translation memory and a term base. It involves putting your text into a project in memoQ. It involves translating. It involves getting it out. So that's what happens in the first lesson. If you take something like a translation memory, I have colleagues who don't really translate, who have heard the phrase translation memory for years. I don't know, they go to talks and they hear it. They must have heard it 100 times, but they still don't really understand what a translation memory is. It's not a difficult concept, but you still have to carefully explain it. Ideally, in your initial text, I don't know, good morning, good morning. You have a repetition. You make a file, making a file. Okay. You call it a box. Okay. You translate good morning, bom dia in Portuguese. And you say, you put that in the box. Now you have a phrase again. If only I could remember how I translated that before. If only I've got a memory of that. Oh, I do have a memory of it. I've got this box where I remember I mean, I won't go on, but you basically very carefully explain the idea. And if you take 10, 15 minutes to very, very clearly explain the concept, students get that in the first hour of use. A term base, how do you translate something from one language to another? I use budget. I'm superstitious. I always say, how do you translate budget in Portuguese? Orçamento. Okay, let's put it. And then you show how it appears in the software, that you can just type the first letter and you can just complete it. So you ask people, how do you annoy them by saying, how do you translate budget into Portuguese? And you ask them about 5 times and they're rather sick of being asked that. Oh, I know, it's like a project. You explain there are going to be 4 screens in memoQ. You say basically I'm somebody who tends to probably over explain rather than under explain, because I think once the basic concepts are there, that's the solid foundation that you can build your software house on. And I suppose one of the things of the first hour of use is we shouldn't underestimate being very careful in explaining the basic building bricks of your software. I suppose that's what I would say. Oh, and also the problems. Any software, for example, your main competitor in the first hour of use, you realize they have they have the word home twice on the same screen. So you can't tell people to click on home. You have to tell them which one.
Which one?
They ask something that says, do you want to make this kind of translation memory or that kind of translation memory? You're not dealing with that concept until a few lessons on. So it's an unnecessary confusion. I'm trying to be polite and mentioning things like that for one of your rivals, but you could argue we might find things like that in memoQ if we
Absolutely.
look closely
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
So be aware of basically, once you've done this a number of times, you see the things that people are going to have problems with, the things that people are going to trip up on, and you say, be careful of this. Don't worry. It doesn't mean what it may, just either ignore it or don't worry, it means this, not that. Okay.
And you skip and promise that you explain later, maybe 2 lessons later, but then you need to be careful to actually return and explain it because you promised.
You very kindly you used the word Renaissance to describe me when you started. In some ways, we need to go back to having Renaissance students.
Absolutely.
But that's a real challenge. And because I had a little flavor of the engineering world, there's a kind of the concepts and notions of that world, especially the analytical skills. In the social sciences and humanities languages, you can't assume those skills are already there. So when it comes to teaching software, maybe at the very least, you have to be a little bit more explicit about certain things. Perhaps there are certain assumptions with engineering students you can make that you can't make with others. Just jumping all the way up to OpenAI, GPT, large language models. I think we discussed last week, or we both mentioned about how useful knowledge of maths is.
Yes.
It's quite a challenge to know what you can do with that with social science and humanities students. I'm not belittling them, but how far can you go in the time you have?
Yeah.
I think
I heard you. Yes, absolutely. I agree. You can make all kinds of false assumptions because of what Steven Pinker calls the curse of knowledge. Because what the background you have, the things you know, defines what kind of knowledge and what kind of understanding you will assume of others. And
and
sometimes
what kind of scaffolding.
many times this will not be accurate. So, and
And what
this is
kinds of
also something, yeah, we need
yeah,
to
sorry, what kinds of scaffolding?
absolutely.
What are the you go into a cloakroom, you put your coat on a hook. What are the hooks on which you put your knowledge? Um, just my
I
screen
like that
just
metaphor very much. Yeah.
you know because yes, and in a way, the Renaissance cloakroom
Yeah.
had lots of different hooks. And how do you, I suppose it's not so much what knowledge you're putting on the hook, but how do you make a new hook, which is a greater challenge? I don't know.
It is a greater challenge because like adding something to what is already there, it's much easier than building up the foundation.
Yeah,
We know that.
yeah,
Yeah, we talked about how we teach people how to translate, how to use technology to translate, and how learning about technology is essential. But thinking of translation students of today, will they get to translate? Because translation is increasingly becoming automated. Obviously, we teach about the
yeah.
various methods of automating translation beyond the translation memories and the term bases. We know that we have technologies like machine translation, large language models, quality estimations, human and automated post editing, and the list goes on. And this has just been accelerated in the past couple of years. So uh, what are your thoughts about the future? Do you think this will be all up to the bias of translation to determine what gets automated and what humans will get to do, or is there any other way? So I'm pretty sure that you have a lot of thoughts about it over the past couple of decades as new technologies emerge pretty much every year.
Yes, I think the issue is, where do I start answering that? I had about six different thoughts in my head. The first thing is, in that first hour of use, you give the students, they will actually be doing some translating at some point. And I actually see a lot of students, for example, will go to an online service, Google Translate, DeepL. And okay, so the first thing you notice is a lot of students coming in already are aware of machine translation services. Because I've retired, I won't see it, but my colleagues will see the similar with, they'll go to Perplexity or something, or they'll go to ChatGPT. So, first obvious piece of data you acquire, students already use services like this. Second, what you tend to notice is they use them without being critical of them. I've been asked to translate this phrase. Let me put this phrase in a machine translation or LLM service. Oh, that's the translation. Copy paste, rather than stopping and saying, is this a good translation? So, first obvious point, people are going to use these services anyway.
Yes.
Students, they're almost, what you can't do is close your eyes and pretend that they don't exist. I mean, I think that's a statement of the obvious, but some people think, well, we won't talk about them. A bit like that's the work of the devil. We will not speak of the devil. But then you apply the phrase, well, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. That's the second stage, I think. If students don't, so you can almost argue that shows the students already on day one of their, or the first week of their translation degree, they don't want to translate, you could argue, or they certainly don't want to translate. Rather than the market imposing that, they are also imposing a post editing, or even a very little post editing in their own default behavior in week one. I agree that students have to learn to translate. Because if you don't learn how to translate, you won't know how to translate. I mean, I actually, when I learned to teach English as a second or foreign language, I also did mathematics as a subsidiary subject. Years ago, decades ago, I had a similar problem, but with people who could not use a calculator. I remember buying two things for 100 a Skudish at the time, before euros. And the assistant in the shop said, okay, 100 and 100, 2,000.
Mm.
And I said, oh, I think you've made a mistake. They've just tapped another zero on the calculator. But there's that, for example, I've also taught technical and scientific translation, Portuguese to English. And one of the concepts you have to introduce is estimation. Maths teachers, when you say doing a piece of arithmetic, you estimate, 20 times 20 is going to be something in the hundreds.
Yeah.
It's not going to be something in the thousands, and it's not going to be something below 100. So the idea of estimation, I've used that with students where you look at Google Maps, for example, and you start with the world. How many clicks to get closer do you need until you get to the street you're in? Is there a name for each of these stages? Okay, at some point you go to continent, subcontinent. Some of them there are, but some anyway. But
Yeah.
the idea of scale is very, very important. Okay, I don't know. I've slightly got distracted, but there are certain translation skills you need. However, it would be naive to assume that, and this apply. I mean, university, when developing critical skills, AI is going to be used to write essays, to code. How can we deal with this? I was tempted to say avoid, but we won't avoid it. Classic example of technology at the moment would be, I don't know, in a school, you give school kids a project, I don't know, prepare a 15-minute presentation in class on Taylor Swift. What do people go? They go to Wikipedia, copy paste the Taylor Swift entry, or some fan site, paste it in the, I don't know, whatever they're using, PowerPoint, Prezi, whatever, and then they just read it off. You have to give them a task. Choose lyrics from 3 of her songs that personally resonate with you, play the extracts, and then explain why they personally resonate with you. So you have to give people a task to avoid the copy paste. And then you can see if people have done something critical. So one of the strategies to do that is to personalize. So you've got to have strategies in your use of technology so that cognitive skills emerge. So, for example, with artificial intelligence, UNESCO in the last 2 or 3 years have published some very good material for educators in general. They've classified the different uses of artificial intelligence. If you search for something like use of AI, UNESCO, you should be able to get their publications, which are quite useful for educators because they talk about different ways in which AI can be used constructively. So that's one thing you have to do. I don't know if I have a feeling I've kind of slightly wandered away from your original question, but I don't know if
This
that's
this this
okay.
is this is no, this is very, very, very useful, and I think much of what you have just said will be an eye opener, at least to a part of the audience. And it just reminded me of 2 things. One of them is that I used to in the late 90s, early 2000s, I used to work for a language technology company. Surprise, surprise. We were making spelling checkers mainly for Hungarian and Romanian, and even there you had to teach people to use the spelling checkers critically, especially for a language with as complex a morphology as Hungarian is,
Mm.
and making people realize that you actually cannot forget your spelling just because you are using a spelling checker. It's
Yeah.
not there to replace your writing skills at the level of spelling. So it's very, very important to keep up the critical thinking about technology. And the other memory that I have is that the 2 most difficult exams I had at engineering schools were both in settings where you were allowed to use any reference materials as you
Yes.
wanted, because those teachers, those professors, didn't believe in just regurgitating, uh,
Yeah.
even when one of them was information theory. So you have a series of theorems and proofs and whatever. So and they realized that the value of education is not to make people memorize things. This is something that a computer does much better than a human does. but to deduce and be able to present in a way that is pertinent to a problem that just popped up. And this is exactly what we were asked to do in the exam.
And,
And that was way before we had large language models, and even
yeah.
then this was important to realize.
I think also it's very important to point out that nowadays translation can have a very, very, very wide range of meanings. And we should look at translation in that sense. Last week, we had presentations by our postgraduate students in a kind of conference for them. And it seemed like even, I don't know, taking the energy, eating and then getting fuel from that is a kind of translation process. You can almost have an intellectual argument. Translation can almost become everything, which is dangerous because then it becomes nothing. But the point is, I've always taught students that thinking of employment in the future, we don't know all the jobs that are going to be created. For example, one job that currently exists definitely is a prompt engineer. 10 years ago, we had no idea that there would be a job called prompt engineer. So it's perfectly reasonable to say in 10 years' time, we don't understand all the jobs that will be created. But prompt engineering is a kind of content translation. You're trying to put into words access. You're trying to find a formula for words that will best enable you to access certain content. And translation traditionally is accessing information or providing information from one language to another. Maybe the language is data and the other language is information, and the language three is knowledge. And how do you translate from data to information? How do you translate from information to knowledge? And perhaps linguistic skills play a part in that. I'm being a bit vague here, but if we understand translation in a much, much more intellectually give it a nice big space, and then I tell students, then there will be employment in that space. What kinds of jobs we will find out if you understand the basics of. If you have good knowledge of languages and the linguistic systems, if you have knowledge of software, how it operates, if we can have knowledge of what's going on with LLMs, understanding of some machine learning, then whatever comes out of this stage we're going through should hopefully make you prepared for the jobs that will appear in the future. I mean, maybe I was told I was a bit too optimistic by somebody last week, but I don't know.
I don't think you are, and it's not being optimistic or pessimistic. And I thank you very much for this, because it's about our understanding about the purpose of education. Because education is not there to restrict you to a certain line of work that you learned about at school. In fact, let's suppose we join a group of people who graduated, say, 10 years ago, and ask them who works in the exact line of work that they were trained for at university, you will see very few hands raising.
Yeah. And there's a very old line, which is your first degree is basically learning how to learn. Okay,
exactly.
There's specific material you've learned, but behind that is making you capable of learning something completely different, that as you live your life and society and knowledge and application of knowledge changes, you are prepared to deal with that. Yeah, I think we're both saying the same thing.
I think we are. And I think we reached the end of this interview. And with
Okay.
that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and not just for the time that you took sitting with me talking about really important things, I think, but I also want to thank you for the decades of work, the advocacy that you put into teaching about translation technology. I think this was very important for the professional community. And I usually, if someone does things like you did, that's no amount of appraisal does it justice, but at least we have to try. So thank you very much again for the interview, for your work. And I'd like to thank the audience for keeping with us and listening to us. And again, please like the video if you do, and subscribe to the memoQ Talks channel, and see you on the next episode. Thank you very much. And thank you, David.
No, it's okay. Thank you. No, it's very
Thank
nice
you.
to meet you. And as I said, you're what Bob Marley would call good people. I think you're a good people, and
Thank you very
that's
much.
what we need really in all areas. Good people. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
And
I thank you
I
on behalf
I,
of the others as well.
I saw you were with it was a very interesting Italian pairing. I saw on LinkedIn a photo of you with Diogo
Oh,
and
you are
Tony
you
and
are you are giving
also
away things, but
hotkeys.
there's gonna be episodes about that too. So.
Okay, well, no, I mean somebody put a photo, so hello. Somebody, I mean,
Yes,
Tony's known for auto hotkeys, so I mean, you know, maybe it's one of those skills we just spoke about, you know.
absolutely, absolutely. Thank
Okay,
you again, and
okay,
I
yeah.
wish you the best, and see you as soon as possible. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you for joining memoQ Talks, where we talked with industry leaders about their experiences and lessons learned to gain new insights about what works best across all areas of localization. Join us next time on memoQ Talks.